Okay. All right. Let us go to Joshua 10, and we're going to read again, especially verses 12 through 14. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jashar? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there was no day like that day before or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Now, if there is a set of verses in the Old Testament that would be more unbelievable than this, I don't know what they would be. This is a source of controversy. If you want to read, 10 or 15 different commentaries, you're going to get a whole bunch of varying ideas. Most of those commentaries will not agree that this was in any way a supernatural activity whatsoever, but it was, the appearance of, it was the opinion of, it was the delusion of, it was the, poetry. This is a spiritual analogy. It didn't really mean. And of course, the reason why they take this position, so many of them, is, several reasons. One, they don't believe the inerrancy and accuracy of the Word of God. Mm-hmm. And anytime something seems to defy a natural pattern, they therefore assume that it cannot be, because somehow they imagine that God is in some way bound by natural patterns, which of course is completely ridiculous, in my opinion. But so this is a difficult passage. Now, as I mention here in A, under the first, we're going to talk about ancient calendars and cultures for a moment. Though for the Christian we accept all statements in God's work as accurate and factual, for some, this section seems unbelievable and therefore too fantastic to interpret literally. I want to note, though, that many of God's miracles in unusual events that He's caused through history actually have physical evidence as a result. Mm-hmm. And I could point a lot of them out to you, but let me just give you two that are obvious. The Bible says that in about 1500 BC, a group of people called the Jews left Egypt and came to the edge of the Red Sea, at which point God caused a tremendous wind to separate the waters of the Red Sea so that on a land bridge the Jews could cross over before Egypt. Now, that is the clear claim in the 12th chapter of Exodus. Seems like a rather remarkable and kind of crazy idea, doesn't it? Now, it's interesting that archaeologists doing underwater excavations in the area of the Red Sea where it's believed that they crossed, because actually there is a underwater bridge that's no more than about 40 feet, I believe, underwater at this point. They have found a whole series of Egyptian chariot wheels that are found in that area. One, of course, was said after the Jews passed, that the Egyptian army, Pharaoh aroused his army and came after them to destroy them, and the waters closed on them and the army was drowned. We have physical evidence. Why else would there be chariot wheels underwater in that area?
Especially if they're all kind of
right. So here's physical evidence that this could or did occur. Another example, of course, because we've talked about the Nephilim, on almost every continent all over the world, we have many examples of large skeletons, anywhere from 8 to as much as over 13 feet tall. We have hundreds of them all over the place. Okay? We have records of them being found. We have pictures of them in the 1850s and the 1860s and the 1870s. We have hundreds of accounts of people digging up these skeletons, okay, of medical examiners of the town coming in saying this looks like it's some huge human skeleton. Okay, they're packed up. The Smithsonian Institute swoops in, takes them, swoops them off into Washington, D.C., and they're never seen again. But in many cases, we have photographs of them as well as reporters' articles of them. We have physical evidence that indeed these things exist.
Well, they were apes, and you know that.
Oh, of course, yeah. Very big,
Apes.
very big,
Yeah.
very big ones, as a matter of fact. So we have lots of other examples of physical evidence of seemingly incredible things that the Bible claims that occur. So I want to propose to you some physical evidence about this event tonight, and this is what we're going to talk about. Now, I will say this, and I could get into a very long, and I won't, I'll try to keep it short, discussion. It isn't really in your outline. The scientific community will claim that this is ridiculous because there's no scientific evidence that this is true. I'm going to present scientific evidence that indeed this can be true, that there's physical astronomical evidence that indeed it did probably happen. I'm going to present that to you. Now, can I prove to you beyond any fact whatsoever that this happened? No, because I don't have a video of someone that was taking it that was there, other than the report of Joshua and the Jews in 1404 BC when we believe this occurred. But let me note this, okay? Science, quote unquote, doesn't have a lot of physical evidence about the things they claim either. For instance, can you please show me the physical evidence based on a correct hypothesis that the theory of evolution is correct? It's a dogma that is accepted by all secular science, and yet show me the evidence.
Because it's not happening now.
It's anecdotal. It's purely anecdotal, and anecdotal is not science.
Yeah.
It's belief. Okay? Show me, for instance, archaeological interpretations of events in the past. You can show me physical evidence of artifacts, but how can you explain the stories of them? It is assumptions based on artifacts that certain events occurred. You can't prove it scientifically. Okay? How about climate change? One of my favorites. Okay?
Yeah.
It is pure anecdotal evidence based on, in many cases, data that has been massaged beyond all belief, okay, to create an illusion of the heating of the earth when we know, for instance, based on historical records, that cycles have occurred of cooling and heating of the earth for thousands of years. Interestingly enough, we can show anecdotal evidence that the opposite is true because we can plot the solar cycles of heat and, increase and decrease of solar output, and they fit exactly in the pattern of increases and decreases in Fahrenheit temperature over hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's anecdotal. So people can want to disprove this and say, you can't prove it. I can claim at the same time that there's a whole lot of things they believe that they can't prove either. So we're equal. Okay? Now, let's go into some of this information. Let's talk about ancient calendars first. Almost all ancient calendars were based on 360-day year. We have Assyrian calendars, Babylonian calendars, Mayan calendars, Hindu calendars, Egyptian calendars, Greek calendars, Phoenician calendars, Chinese, Teuton, Carthaginian, and all. There's probably over 300 calendar systems prior to 701 BC, and every one of them practically is built on a 360-day year. Okay? Hundreds of them. Lots of evidence. Now, there's a very interesting question to ask about this. Why are they built on a 360-day year, and why wasn't there correction made prior to 701 BC of these calendars, since if the day was actually 365.25 days per year, in no more than 10 or 15 or 20 years, we would be off a whole season. Take 5.25 times 10, and what do you get? Like 55 days. So in 10 years, we would have 55 days off of the seasons. In 20 years, we'd have 110 days off. So people were now trying to plant when it was time to harvest, etc. I don't think these people were so stupid in a matter of 20 years that they couldn't figure out something's wrong. But you don't find corrections of these calendars prior to 701 BC. But
Did the Earth move? The globe, the axis move?
when?
I don't know when.
Well, the inclination of the axis has probably changed many times. The inclination of the axis actually changes over a period of 22,000 years in what's called precession. Now, do you understand what precession is? Imagine a spinning top, okay, and watch this axis on the top of it. What does the axis do? Even though the top spins, the axis slowly rotates in a 360 degree. That's called precession. The Earth spins, and it also has precession also, okay? So the inclination of the Earth does change over in a natural way over that period of time, okay? Now, the interesting thing is, after 701 BC, you have almost all these calendar systems that were not the ones that were ancient and no longer around, okay, but the ones that continue to be exist after 701, changing their calendar systems to, in one way or another, a 365-day year.
Why you pick up this day, 701?
Because it's a very unique time.
But it's not when the battle happened.
No, it's not when the battle happened. I think you're going to see as I go through this why 701 BC is a very significant day.
Okay.
And it changed something very significantly in the orbits of the planets of our solar system.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's unique. And it's shown in cultures to, after that time, things changed. Then you find people scrambling to come up with a different calendar system and changing calendar systems, but only after 701 BC. Okay? So keep that in mind as we go through this. Now, I make the point in C, if there was a Joshua's Long Day in Israel, would we not expect other cultures to comment on it? As a matter of fact, would we not expect cultures that were on the other side of the planet from the Middle East to talk rather about a Joshua's long night, and those that were closer to the Middle East talking about a Joshua's long day? Okay? Well, interestingly enough, here's what we see. And I picked out 9 examples, and I could give you another 100. There is a record of the Chinese long night, quote unquote, during the reign of Emperor Yao. Do I am not pronouncing it right, Yao?
Perfect.
Perfect. It's probably terrible pronunciation. Yao's empire was in the 15th century BC. In other words, in the 1400s. Okay? There's the Greek story of Phaeton, who was, quote, the son of Apollo, who disrupted the sun's course and caused an elongated day.
I've heard that.
Okay? In New Zealand, we have the story of the Maori people and the story of their champion, Maui, who slowed the sun so that the sunrise was delayed on one day. Okay? And if you think about where New Zealand is, it would make sense why that was true. Okay? We have an example in Mexico's Annals of the, if you can pronounce it, okay, whatever, citing the story of a unique long night. We have the Phoenician story of Phaeton, who is a Canaanite prince who feared the earth was in danger because of a day of elongated sunlight. Which makes sense because Phoenicia is really close to Israel. We have the story of Bacchus found in the Orphic hymns, who arrested the course of the sun and the moon for a whole day. Arrested.
Yeah,
Stopped.
right,
Stopped it.
right.
Okay? We have the Indian story of how Arjun, while mourning the death of Krishna, caused the sun to, quote, stand still. We have the Buddhist tale of how Matina prevented the sun from rising on one day. Plus, we have similar traditions also, and I could go on, by the Aztecs, the Babylonians, the Persians. Matter of fact, there are many, many Native American traditions of the long night. Okay? We have Hopi. We have all these Navajo. We have all these in their oral traditions. So, we have a lot of evidence in cultures of either a long day or a long night, which you would expect to be if indeed there was a Joshua's long day.
It's like the thing about flood.
Right. We have all these flood stories all over the earth because there was a flood. Okay? Now, let's go to number 2. The histories of telescopes and Gulliver's Travels. You go, he really is kind of a nerd, isn't he? And I am. Okay? I love this because it's all science. Okay? Now, we notice that Galileo invented the first known telescope in 1610 AD. And as a result, he discovered the 4 moons of Jupiter, and also he found Saturn's rings. Okay? Wasn't a really very powerful telescope, but he was at least able to see those things with it.
Was he the one who was actually executed?
Now, Galileo wasn't executed. He was put under the ban by the Roman Catholic Church. I don't think they killed him finally. They put him in I think they locked him in his own house for years and years and years, told him he couldn't talk, couldn't write, couldn't do anything. In 1781, with a much better telescope invented, Herschel discovered the planet Uranus, and Herschel, a few years later, with even a better telescope, in 1787, found the 2 moons of Uranus. In 1846, Leverrier found a moon of Neptune. And in 1877, Hall, using the new naval telescope that was in Annapolis, discovered the 2 moons of Mars called Deimos and Phobos, which are very interesting, and I think as I go on and describe this to you, their names are very perfect. Their names mean panic and fear. That's what their names mean in Greek. Okay? Both of these moons are only approximately 8 miles in diameter and are almost totally black in color and therefore don't reflect light. That's part of why it took so long to discover them, both their small size and the fact that they didn't have what we call albedo, or reflection of light. Now, there's an interesting story that we can talk about called Gulliver's Travels, which many of you may have read when you were children or going through school. It was written by the famous satirist Jonathan Swift, and in it, Gulliver travels to a number of different places. In his first travel, he goes to Lilliput, and of course he finds the Lilliputans, and of course he appears huge and large compared to the Lilliputans, and they are small and tiny. But then on his third travel, he goes to a different place called Laputa. Now, this is all fictional, understand. These are fictional stories written by him. And there in Laputa, Gulliver talks to their astronomers who brag about their discovery of Mars' 2 moons, detailing their size and orbits to close to 20% of accuracy, we find. The thing that's interesting about the story is that Swift writes about them and describes them 151 years before anyone ever discovered them. And the question is, how can he write about the 2 moons of Mars and describe their relative size and their orbits 151 years before anyone discovered them?
How?
My only conclusion could be because he was familiar with some ancient literature that told him that there were 2 moons of Mars. And in reading it, he incorporated it into his stories. Either that or he's one heck of a good guesser. And I prefer to believe he read something that he was that good a guesser. You can conclude for yourself. Now, as we'll see, as I talk about this further, there's evidence that we'll see which indicates that on a number of occasions, Mars may have been as near in its passes to the Earth as close as 70,000 miles from it. I will tell you that if indeed Mars passed within 70,000 miles of Earth, it appeared 50 times larger on the horizon than a full moon.
Okay,
and it would be bright red.
could you go through this one more time?
Okay. I'm going to talk about the near passes of Mars with Earth in a minute, okay? It is estimated that in these near passes that Mars approached the Earth within 70,000 miles, which would have made it at its closest part, which is called perihelion, okay? It would have appeared 50 times bigger on Earth's horizon than the moon ever does. Think about how moon looks on the horizon. 50 times bigger than that would be the size of Mars when that occurs.
Do we know how often that happens?
We estimate, from what we can tell, it happens in 7 different cycles, starting in 1404 BC, which is an interesting date, because it's estimated that that was indeed the time of Joshua's long day. Now, this would have caused some very interesting effects on the Earth. It is also, and I'll go into this, it is also believed through the calculations which I'm going to show you that not only were there near passes between Mars and Earth, but there were near passes between Venus and Mars, and there were even near passes of Mars to Jupiter. Now, in near passes between Mars and Jupiter, Mars would have gone through what today we call the asteroid field, which exists between Mars and Jupiter, also called the Van Allen belt. We know for a fact, because of telescopic evidence, there's over 5,000 different meteorite-sized rocks that exist in that belt. And it's believed that the gravitational influence of Mars, if indeed it passed that close, would have grabbed a number of those space rocks and brought them into its gravitational field, which would have created a very interesting event when Mars got that close to Earth. That means that the atmosphere of Earth would have collected those, and a certain number of them would have rained down on the Earth. Now, there are over 170 different meteorite crater sites on the Earth. Did you know that? There are some that are fairly obvious, like in Winslow, Arizona, or the one in the Yucatan Peninsula. Some of them you can only see from space because they've been eroded over time. We have a very famous one, pronounce it in Russia, in Siberia, called Tunguska. Yeah. And that one occurred, we know, because we had people that actually heard it and were alive during it. It occurred in 1908. It was a meteorite or a bolide. A bolide is a meteorite-type substance that has a gaseous element to it, so when it comes into the Earth, it explodes, okay, where meteorites impact if they're big enough on the Earth. it produced what they estimate to be at least a 15 kiloton explosion over that area in Siberia, and it affected over, I think it was over 2,000 square miles of forest. Within hundreds of miles, it blew the forest completely down, all the trees, in a pattern of explosion. Okay? It was heard 2,000 miles away. It was so loud. So we know these events have occurred. Interestingly enough, if you go out and if you looked at the moon a couple days ago, 2 days ago, and the lunar full moon, okay, if you look at the moon, there's one conclusion that you should have by looking at it, particularly when it's a full moon, and that is somebody beat that thing up because it's got craters all over it. If you look with a telescope or Hubble Space Telescope at the surface of Mars, what do you find all over the surface of Mars? Craters. Matter of fact, it's very interesting, though. On Mars, 93% of the craters are in one hemisphere. So apparently, the way it got cratered was that it was turned one way. I'm going to suggest to you that may have occurred in its pass-bys on the Earth, okay? And therefore, it was cratered extensively on one hemisphere, but very minimally on the other. If you look at Hubble space stuff and some of the satellites that we've sent to explore Venus, it's cratered. So we have experience of a tremendous amount of cratering which has occurred on these planets. Now I want to show you, let's see if I can, you're going to have to turn that so I can, there we go. Okay, so let me open this into bigger. This is what is proposed as the Mars-Earth orbital resonance model. And what orbital resonance means is that as Mars comes closer to Earth, this is the orbit of Earth, this is the orbit of Mars, as they come close at this point, there is a tremendous amount of both gravitational energy and magnetic energy, which ends up being transferred between these two large bodies. Okay? As you go this way, it's transferred from Mars to Earth, and as it gets on this side, it's transferred from Earth to Mars. Okay? Now, they estimate that here, which is the March 21st, I'm sorry, here on the fall on the October 25th, that there were a tremendous number of cataclysmic events which occurred on the Earth, would have occurred on the surface of Mars, but nobody's there to figure that one out, okay? For instance, if you go back in history, you find it, interestingly enough, every 108 years, we find from 701 BC towards the time of Joshua, 1400 BC, every 108 years we have all kinds of interesting histories of cataclysmic events that go on. For instance, the Trojan War, which occurred in the 9th century, 8th century BC, we have stories that when they tried to invade Troy at this time of the year, okay, that the armor used, which was iron, of the Trojan army caused electrical effects which electrified the soldiers. Written in the history of the Greeks. You go, why? Because the magnetic influence that would have occurred on the Earth would have been phenomenal. You would have had unbelievable magnetic storms and lightning going on because of this. Okay? Plus, you would have had these space rocks brought along, okay, by Mars, which would have entered into Earth's atmosphere, and you also would have had land tides, as well as enormous ocean tides, which occurred. But interestingly enough, this effect would only be that catastrophic for about 24 hours. And then it would start to pass beyond and lose a certain amount of energy. So what we believe has occurred is since 1404 BC, every 108 years, in cycles about 7 times, until 701 BC, we had these events that were Mars-Earth orbital resonance events, which caused catastrophes on the Earth. Okay?
So we don't have them anymore.
No. At 701 BC, we finally had, after 7 cycles of this approximately, an equalization of this energy so that the orbits of Earth and the orbits of Mars rearranged to stabilize. Interestingly enough, Mars lost about 28 days in its orbit around the Sun, and Earth gained 5.25 days, which is why after 701 BC, the calendar had to be adjusted, because what is believed is Earth's original orbit around the Sun was 360 days, not 365.25. Only after 701 did it become 365.25 days. Okay? Now,
have you ever considered teaching this in high school?
oh yeah, they'd throw me out.
Why?
Okay? Because they wouldn't believe it.
Present to himself.
Okay, why can I not get this to close now? Close.
And it hit escape button.
Okay. Now, I want to go to another. This one you'll really enjoy. My wife really enjoyed it. Okay. These are tables. Now, they were created by 2 guys, I think I have their names down here, that are astronomers. They wrote a book called The Mars-Earth Wars. I'm sorry, I'm down under 4. I skipped ahead. I'm down under 4, the stories Angular Momentum. They wrote this book called The Mars-Earth Wars. Their names, the astronomers' names, are Patton and Windsor. And they did a multi-year study of the mathematical calculations based on planetary masses, okay, relative size of each planet, weight of the planets, their mass, mass basically, and orbital eccentricity, in other words, what's the elliptical nature of the orbits of the planets. And they ended up with these calculations showing mathematically, and I'm just going to show you, okay, as they did this, the different tables these are just a few of the tables they created. They created them for Venus, for the Earth-Moon combination, for Mars and Jupiter, okay? Each one of those planets. They calculated these different elements, their orbital eccentricity, their period, in other words, the amount of the period around the Sun, etc., and developed a model on these things which demonstrated the relative orbits that used to be of Jupiter, Venus, Mars, and the Earth-Moon system. What they showed in their mathematics is that prior to 701 BC, the orbits of these planets were extremely different, and they intersected each other. Well, not Jupiter. Jupiter came close to Mars, but they intersected. Venus intersected the orbit of Mars. Mars intersected the orbit of Earth. Okay, and events occurred, and energies were transferred, and only after the stabilization occurred in 701 BC do we have the orbits that we see today. Okay?
Why would God do that?
I don't know. Maybe he did it because he needed to target meteorites for a day of battle. I mean, I believe it.
Maybe for you to have fun tonight.
Or for me to have fun tonight. Maybe that's why God did it. Okay. So, I'm just pointing this out to you. There's a lot of table data in this book. It's an interesting book. I pulled some stuff out of the 11th chapter of this book. And just to show you that there are people who are competent astronomers who will say that uniformitarianism of the universe is wrong. Okay? That actually, until 701 BC, it was catastrophism. Periodic catastrophic events occurring.
So 701 BC, that is because of 7 cycles
Finished. and we had an equalization of energies.
Why is it only Jupiter, Venus, Mars, and Earth?
Well, because they are the closest.
Okay. So the
There-
other planets,
It is believed to be that there existed a planet between Mars and Jupiter, which is why we have a meteorite belt there. Okay? Most astronomers agree that it existed. A lot of people think that this is the reason why it's torn apart, because it was originally part of the play here, but it was torn apart by the gravitational forces where it got too close to Jupiter.
So all that for Joshua to win the battle?
Yep, all that for Joshua to win the battle.
Can I take a stab at Ann's question?
Yes.
When you look at our creation, trillions of stars, planets out there, and we find the scripture says, and God placed them and called them by name. Fast forward to the book of Revelation. There's things that are there that will happen that are heavenly. Things, I firmly believe that God's plan from day one was Joshua was going to need that extra day for the battle.
And he's going to need the meteorites.
He's going to need the meteorites. And think of from an engineering point of view, if you've got 1 trillion stars and they're all doing this, the mighty God that we serve goes, I need this one to move over here, and I need this one to move here, so they all come together to give Joshua that time, to give Sodom and Gomorrah, whatever those issues are, that God had planned it that precisely to the hundredth decimal point and put them in motion. It says it was very good. So I don't believe it was an accident yet. I really believe it was.
well, I don't believe it was an
God was
accident, but I
orchestrating
just
stars.
wonder why.
It's a,
Well, yeah, it's an amazing plan. Like I said, God is the author of mathematics, of astronomy, of everything. So He's behind all.
Think of how many catastrophes God has used just on this planet.
Right.
Is it too far to believe that He's used them in a planetary way, in a solar system? I think not.
Well, it makes more sense, too, to think that this was all planned out ahead of time, and all at once, like, He looks down and says, whoops, like, this is what I need to do now.
I want to talk a minute about Immanuel Velikovsky. Immanuel Velikovsky is a Russian Jew. He was born, I think, about 1910. He was an accomplished psychiatrist, and he was a many, many years long amateur astronomer. And he wrote an extremely controversial book in 1950 called Worlds in Collision. And in this book, he claimed, though he didn't have the math that's here to do it like these guys did, he claimed exactly what these guys have shown mathematically. He claimed that Jupiter changed its orbit because of its near pass-bys with Mars. He claimed that Venus changed its orbit because of pass-bys with Mars. He claimed that Earth changed its orbit. And he claimed in this book that it's the reason why Joshua's long day occurred. And that's what he says. Now, this created in the 1950s, 60s, and he was published in this book. He was in Reader's Digest. He was in all kinds of magazines. He was, if you go back to the literature, a lot of people took up Velikovsky's work and they cited it, you know, in these various periodicals. He was not cited in scientific periodicals because the science community thought that Velikovsky was a moron. They stated that he was only an amateur astronomer and therefore had no right to comment about things that only astronomers in their great wisdom could ever possibly comment on. Okay? They argued with him. They debated him. There were papers and letters back and forth. Carl Sagan of the famous Cosmos fame, okay, I won't talk about him. But anyway, he actually debated Velikovsky at one point, and it's reported in a news article that actually Carl Sagan didn't end up so well in the debate. Okay? Velikovsky was a very brilliant man. Of course, he ended up, the astronomical community, of course, cited against him. They said that his view of mythology was incorrect, that his interpretation of planetary motions and planetary energies was incorrect, yada, 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 and of course tried to characterize him as a quack. It's interesting that when these guys, years and years and years later, did their mathematical work, it demonstrated that Velikovsky was absolutely correct. That he didn't know how to do it, but they did. And they demonstrated that his conjectures and his views about planetary motions in 108 cycles of catastrophic incursions between Mars, for instance, and the Earth, indeed had mathematical basis to them. So it's a very interesting story about him. He, of course, stated, again, that because of calendar changes, he believed that after 701 BC, there was a stabilization of these planetary energies, and therefore only after that point did they stabilize in the orbits that we saw them today. Now, one of the reasons why astronomers absolutely hate this idea is because they're committed to the idea that the universe is billions and billions and billions of years old. As a matter of fact, if you study the astronomical literature, you find that every 10 or so years, the universe gets another billion or so years older. It does. You go back to the 30s, and they estimate it to be 3 or 4 billion. You go in the 50s, it's 5 or 6 billion.
Not a billion more.
Okay? And all of a sudden, it becomes billions and billions and billions of years older. But what Velikovsky said, what these guys claim, is exactly what the Bible seems to teach us, and that is we live in a relatively young solar system on a relatively young Earth, and we have relatively young cataclysmic events which have occurred. These guys show you that it's really a young Earth system. We have a lot of evidence of that. When Neil Armstrong went to the moon in 1969, when he landed on the moon, okay, they collected moon dust. It was a few inches deep on the moon, which is very problematic. Do you know why it's very problematic? Because if the moon is billions of years old and it's collected dust over billions of years, it should be hundreds of feet thick. But it's only a few inches thick. That's a problem. Any of the new Earth, young solar system facts, and there's lots of them, okay, are simply dismissed by astronomers because they have a prejudicial view that the Earth and the solar system and the universe is old. Okay? That is their bias. So, now,
should we skip quiz next week?
yes, I want to see her come up with the quiz next week.
No, we're not no quiz next week. No.
Jack.
Where does this carbon testing come in? It seems like science uses proof that everything's so old.
Well, carbon testing can be accurate except for one problem. You can only do it on carbon-based things. So you can't carbon date a rock.
You mean organic?
It has to be organic. It has to have carbon in it. It has to be wood or plant-based or something like that. And it's probably good to maybe 10 or 15,000 years. Okay, it has accuracy. But beyond that, it isn't good. You know, it's like there's so many. First, you know that in the 1980s in Montana, they dug up a Tyrannosaurus hip bone. Now, notice what I didn't say. I didn't say a Tyrannosaurus hip fossil. I said a hip bone. They took it because they knew it was bone and not fossil, because fossil is rock. They cut into it, and they found red material in the marrow. That's problematic. So then they took it because they wanted to prove that it wasn't organic. It wasn't really blood. So they took it, extracted it, and injected it in mice. And guess what they found? That the mice had an antibody reaction to what they injected. Therefore, it was blood. Now, how do you explain that they came up with a Tyrannosaurus bone with blood in it when they claim that Tyrannosaurus rex existed on this earth 75 million years ago? Okay? They have another problem. They're extracting all kinds of DNA from things, okay, that are ancient. There's one problem with that. The deterioration rate of DNA is probably in the order of 50 to 75,000 years at most. Therefore, if these things are old, how is there any DNA left? I mean, there's all kinds of evidence in science that things are not as old as they say they are, but they need to believe they're old. And therefore, they prejudice their view and they look for evidence of old things, old universe, old stars, okay, all these things. But it's a prejudicial view. It's an a priori assumption. You can't prove it's scientific. It's an assumption. Okay? So at any rate, we'll say that we have our own assumptions about Joshua's long day. But we do have a certain amount of evidence to those assumptions, and we have certain explanations for how it could have occurred. So I choose to believe that it did occur. It may have occurred in these ways. Other questions? This is kind of, my wife said, this is awfully complicated. And I said, let me tell you, I could have made it a lot more complicated.
Dealing with Dumbo there, so I'm thinking for myself.
No. Go ahead. Ask questions.
So all I could say is if it's between the beginning and the end of this book, I believe it.
That's right.
So because there isn't anything that I know contrary to what this word says that contradicts the word. So, and for thousands of years, people have tried to contradict the word in the Old Testament. In your opinion, though, how long do you think the earth was created by God shortly before Adam and Eve then came on?
I do.
Yeah. Because I think the idea that God had all along was to put Adam and Eve on the earth. And so
either that's true or otherwise Satan had a very long vacation before he decided to come to earth and tempt Eve. Why would he wait a few millennia to do it? Maybe he would, but why would he? I'm sorry.
How long do you think Adam and Eve were here before they ate the apple?
A long enough time to walk in the garden with God quite a few times.
Enough to have babies,
Enough,
because it says you're greatly increased with pain, so they had to have children before, right?
well, definitely.
No record on this here.
Then it says, I'll greatly increase your pain.
Well,
So you
maybe
wonder if
he
you didn't
just
have it
planned
before.
on them not having any, and now he's saying you're going to, and you weren't
But,
going to.
no. The first commandment, be fruitful and multiply, and then King James said, and replenish the earth.
Replenish.
So they were told to have children, to populate. It wasn't their choice.
But it doesn't mean they did it before they sinned.
When Adam looked at that woman, he goes, whoa, man.
It still doesn't mean they have babies.
I promise you, they were following God's command.
Right.
Fruitful and multiply.
Where Cain find his wife?
It says true.
Without genetic anomalies, which there wouldn't have been that early on, and there wouldn't have been a problem with them. Anyway, now, how did Noah and his family populate the earth? By relatives. Okay. Questions, comments,
I like
I want to give you an opportunity to at least say, what the heck? What's angular momentum? Why talking about orbital science?
when these two planets passed within 70,000 miles of each other, there had to be some kind of effect on both planets as they passed.
Oh, massive.
Uh-huh.
There must have been unbelievable tsunamis on the oceans. There's so much gravitational effect at 70,000 miles when you look at their masses that there would be literally land tides, earthquakes that would make the land literally ripple. Okay?
Well, then people wouldn't be on the face of the earth at that period of time.
No, I think they were. I think they were. Now, here's one thing I want to mention. In history and in mythology both, there is a very strong tradition of Mars being associated with fear. Mars was called the god of war, okay? Almost universally. And if you go from culture to culture, when you have stories about the planet Mars, it provokes fear in people. Okay? Why? Because it caused catastrophic effects on the Earth. Therefore, if you saw that planet getting close and getting bigger on the horizon, what do you know was probably going to happen?
Tsunami.
Bad things
Yes.
were going to happen.
Get into the basement.
That's right. Get into the basement. That's right. I hope it doesn't collapse.
Yes.
Well, even back to the story of Noah, when the flood happened, when you see the land being divided, I promise you there was something going on in the heavens that created that scenario to happen.
That caused the tectonic plates to split like that. Again, it's another example. The scientists will agree that there was a supercontinent called Pangaea. Pretty much they agree. I mean, all I have to do is look at a picture of the globe, and it really, yeah, that's catastrophism. That means there was a supercontinent, okay, and then it split. We have indication in the 10th chapter of Genesis that of an event, an era where it did split. Okay, under the, what was his name now? Can't remember. It says during his era. Peleg. And it says, yeah, that the earth was separated. Okay, so we have, the history of this planet. When you look at ice cores, when you look at all these different evidences, strata, is catastrophism. Over and over and over again. Okay? This is simply another cycle of catastrophism that seems to occur. Yeah.
Will probably happen in Revelation.
Yes, which is going to be another series of catastrophes. All right, so let's stop. And yeah, who would like, Gary, would you close us in prayer tonight?
Dear God, what a